Somewhere deep in the American Midwest, far from highways and living towns, there existed an abandoned zoo that no map bothered to mark anymore. A place swallowed by time, rust, and silence, where broken cages stood like open graves and cracked concrete paths were slowly being reclaimed by weeds that grew as if they had permission from something beneath the soil. And for over 20 years, the locals avoided this place, not because it was dangerous in the usual sense, but because it felt wrong, as if the air itself resisted being breathed, and officially the zoo had closed due to financial problems. Yet no one who worked there ever told the same story twice, because some said the animals had grown violent without reason, others said they stopped eating and stared for hours at something no one else could see, and a few whispered that the zoo never really shut down at all, but was simply abandoned in a hurry, leaving behind cages, tools, and memories that refused to decay. And at the very center of the zoo stood the reason most people never dared enter after sunset, a massive, leafless tree with trunks so wide it would have taken 5 grown men holding hands to wrap around it, its bark blackened and twisted like burned flesh, its roots breaking to the concrete and spreading across the zoo grounds like veins. And despite appearing completely dead, the tree never rotted, never fell, and never changed with the seasons, standing tall through storms, winters, and decades, as if it were anchored to something deeper than the earth itself. And the locals had a name for it, one spoken only in low voices, the haunted zoo tree, because they believed that every animal that suffered and died within those walls had left something behind, not bones or bodies, but pain, fear, and rage that sank in the ground and climbed upward into the tree, turning it into something that listened, remembered, and waited. And stories spread that late at night strange sounds echoed from the zoo, metal clanging though no wind blew, distant roars from empty cages, and sometimes a low creaking noise that sounded disturbingly like breathing. And those who lived nearby swore they saw shadows moving between enclosures long after the sun had set. Yet despite all the warnings and whispered legends, curiosity still pulled people in, especially those who believed fear was just another myth. And that was exactly what brought 3 college friends, Jack, Emma, and Lucas, to the rusted gates. One moonless night, armed with flashlights, cameras, and laughter that echoed far too loudly in a place that demanded silence. Because Jack saw the trip as nothing more than a thrill, a story to tell later, Emma came for the photographs, fascinated by abandoned places frozen in time, and Lucas, quiet and skeptical, insisted that everything had a logical explanation. And as they forced open the zoo's bent iron gates, the sound of metal scraping against metal rang out like a warning bell. But none of them turned back, stepping inside as the air immediately changed, growing colder, heavier, pressing against their skin in a way that made breathing feel deliberate. And as they walked deeper along the cracked path, their flashlights revealed empty cages with doors hanging open, claw marks etched deep into steel bars, and feeding trays still bolted in place, as if no one had bothered to remove them. And that was when they saw the tree for the first time, looming in the distance like a silhouette against the dark sky, larger than it had any right to be, its branches stretching outward like frozen arms. And for reasons none of them could explain, their conversation died the moment the tree came into view, because something about it commanded attention, demanded it, and Emma felt an unexplained pressure behind her eyes. Jack's joking smile faded, and Lucas slowed his steps, his gaze locked onto the trunk as if it were staring back. And when they finally reached the clearing, around the tree, the ground beneath their feet felt warmer than the rest of the zoo, unnaturally so, and the air carried a faint, rotten smell mixed with something metallic. And though there was no wind, the branches above them shifted slightly, producing a low wooden groan that vibrated through the clearing, and Jack laughed nervously and said it was just the wood settling. But even as he spoke, the zoo gates behind them slammed shut with a deafening crash that echoed through the abandoned enclosures, cutting off their way out. And in that moment, as silence rushed back in, each of them felt it, the unmistakable sensation that they were no longer alone, that something ancient and patient had finally noticed them, and deep within the bark of the haunted zoo tree, something stirred, as if it had been waiting a very long time for new visitors. The moment the zoo gate slammed shut behind them, the sound echoed unnaturally long, bouncing from cage to cage until it seemed to crawl back toward the clearing. And in the silence that followed, Jack, Emma, and Lucas stood frozen, suddenly aware of how small they were inside a place that felt vast and watching. And Jack tried the gate, pulling hard until rust flakes cut into his palms, but it wouldn't move, as if it fused itself shut. And when he laughed again, it came out wrong, too loud, too forced, and quickly died when the tree responded with a deep creaking sound that rolled through its trunk like a slow breath. And Emma felt at first a strange pressure at her chest, as though the air had thickened and was sinking into her lungs instead of filling them. And she lifted her flashlight toward the branches just in time to see them shift, not sway, but twist, bending in directions which should not bend. And Lucas whispered that trees made noises all the time, that old wood expanded and cracked, but his voice lacked conviction, because even he could see that something was wrong with the bark, which now appeared uneven, bulging in places like skin stretched over bone. And as they stood there staring, shapes began to surface slowly, as if pushed outward from inside the trunk. First vague impressions, then clearer outlines, until Emma realized with horror that they were faces, animal faces, emerging silently from the wood, their features distorted but unmistakable. A lion's open mouth frozen mid-roar, a bear's broken snout, a monkey's wide, terrified eyes, all locked in expressions of endless pain. And the smell grew stronger, coppery, and rotten, making Emma gag as she stumbled backward, bumping into Jack, who dropped his flashlight, sending it rolling across the ground where it came to rest pointed directly at the tree, illuminating dozens more faces carved not by any tool, but by something alive, something remembering. And the realization hit them all at once that these weren't carvings at all but impressions, as though the tree had absorbed them while they were still struggling, and the ground beneath their feet trembled faintly, pulsing in time with the creaking of the trunk. And that was when the sounds began, not loud at first, but unmistakable, low growls, distant screeches, the clatter of metal cages slamming shut, all layered together into a chorus of suffering that seemed to rise in the soil itself. And Emma clamped her hands over her ears, but the noise didn't fade, because it wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from everywhere, including inside her head, and she dropped to her knees as images flooded her mind without warning. Flashes of animals pacing endlessly in two small cages, starving, sick, beaten, their fear seeping into ground with every breath, feeding something that had been growing for years beneath the zoo. And Lucas screamed to them to run, but his feet wouldn't move because his eyes were locked onto a section of the trunk where the bark was splitting open slowly, revealing darkness inside, deeper than any hollow tree should have. And something about that darkness felt inviting, not comforting, but curious, as though it was studying him just as intently, and against every instinct screaming at him to flee. Lucas stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached out, muttering that it had to be some kind of illusion, some mass hallucination caused by fear and suggestion. But the moment his fingers brushed the bark, the tree reacted violently, its branches snapping downward with explosive force, roots tearing free of the ground like massive fingers as the trunk split wider, opening like a mouth. And before Jack or Emma could reach him, the roots wrapped around Lucas's legs and torso, lifting him screaming into the air as the animal faces around him twisted, their silent mouths opening wider in what looked disturbingly like anticipation. And Lucas screamed Jack's name, Emma's name, his voice cracking with pure terror as he clawed at the roots. But the bark burned his skin, leaving blackened marks wherever he touched it. And the tree pulled him closer, inch by inch, the darkness inside the trunk swallowing the light from the fallen flashlight, until Lucas's body was nothing more than a silhouette thrashing helplessly. And then, in a final violent motion, the trunk snapped shut around him, cutting off his scream mid-breath. And the forest went silent, so silent that Jack could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. And Emma stared at the place where Lucas had vanished, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes had just seen, until a new shape began to push outward from the bark, slowly, deliberately, and as the wood reshaped itself, forming familiar contours. Emma let out a broken sob, because staring back at her from the trunk was Lucas's face, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a scream that would never end. And Jack grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her away just as the ground shuddered again, cracks spreading across the clearing as the roots reburied themselves, and the tree settled back into stillness, its branches rising slowly as if satisfied. And for a brief, horrifying moment, Jack could swear the faces in the bark were watching them leave, tracking their movement with hungry patience. And as Jack dragged Emma away from the clearing, Jack barely remembered which path he took as he dragged Emma through the collapsing maze of the abandoned zoo, because the layout no longer obeyed logic, the cracked walkways bending and looping back on themselves as if the ground were alive and deliberately confusing them. And every time Jack glanced over his shoulder, The massive silhouette of the haunted zoo tree seemed closer than before, not because it moved, but because the space between them was shrinking, folding inward like a closing, wound, and Emma stumbled repeatedly, her body trembling violently, her lips moving soundlessly as though she were still trying to scream for Lucas, but no sound would come, only a thin wheeze that terrified Jack more than any roar could have. And as they ran past empty enclosures, Jack swore he saw movement behind the bars, shadows pacing, eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam, claws scraping softly against metal, as if the animals had returned, not in flesh, but in memory, anger, and hunger, and the air grew warmer with every step, thick with the same coppery stench that now coated Jack's tongue, making him feel as if he were breathing blood, and suddenly the path ended at a collapsed wall, bricks piled high and blocking what Jack was sure had been an exit just minutes earlier, and when he turned back in panic, the zoo gates they had entered through were gone, replaced by an unbroken fence swallowed by vines and rust, as though the world outside had never existed, and Emma finally found her voice then, whispering that the zoo was closing in on them, that it was feeding the tree by trapping them inside, and Jack wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there had to be a way out, but the ground beneath them shuddered again, deeper this time, and from somewhere far behind them came the slow, deliberate sound of what creaking, rhythmic, and patient, like footsteps, and they ran again, lungs burning, hearts hammering, passing the remains of cages that now appeared occupied by dark, pulsing shapes that pressed against the bars as they passed, and Jack realized with dawning horror that the tree wasn't just at the center of the zoo. It was the zoo, its roots threading beneath every enclosure, every path, every wall, and the entire place was nothing more than a body built to trap prey, and as exhaustion began to take hold, Jack spotted a small service building ahead, its door hanging open, and without thinking he pulled Emma inside, slamming it shut behind them and pressing his weight against it as the walls vibrated faintly, and for a moment there was silence, broken only by Emma's sobbing and Jack's ragged breathing. In the flickering light of the single bulb still somehow glowing above them, Jack noticed scratch marks covering the walls, layered so thickly they looked carved, and names etched deep into the concrete. Names of former workers, visitors, and people who must have wandered in just like they had, believing the stories were exaggerations. And Emma traced one name with shaking fingers before collapsing to the floor, whispering that Lucas's name would be there soon, that the tree would carve it itself, and Jack knelt beside her, telling her they weren't done yet, that trees could burn, that if they could reach the center again with fire they could kill it. And as if the zoo itself had heard him, the light above them flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into darkness, just as something massive slammed against the door from the outside, with splintering inward with each impact, and Jack grabbed a rusted flare from a shelf he hadn't noticed before, striking it desperately as the door burst open and roots flooded the room like living snakes, wrapping around Emma's legs and dragging her screaming toward the doorway, and Jack lunged forward, slashing the roots with a broken tool while shoving the burning flare into mass of twisting wood. And the tree screamed then, not with sound, but with a pressure that slammed into Jack's skull, flooding his mind with images of decades of suffering, animals dying alone in cages, caretakers turning away, cruelty ignored, and the tree feeding on it all until it became something more than nature, something vengeful and eternal. And the roots recoiled, releasing Emma as smoke filled the room, and Jack grabbed her hand and ran again, following the tree's screams back toward a central clearing, because he understood now that the only way out was through the heart of it. And when they burst into the open, the haunted zoo tree towered above them, its trunk split wide, glowing faintly from within as faces writhed across its surface, animal and human alike, Lucas's face screaming silently among them. And Jack hurled a flare into the open trunk just as the branches crashed down around them, wrapping tight and lifting them off the ground. And for one brief, hopeful moment the tree burned, flames crawling up its bark as the clearing shook violently, and Emma fell free, hitting the ground hard as Jack screamed for her to run. And she did, sobbing, sprinting blindly as the fire consumed the trunk and the tree let out one final, shuddering roar that echoed across the zoo. And then everything went still, and when the sun rose the next morning, the zoo was quiet, the tree blackened and cracked, smoke curling faintly into the pale sky, and police later found Emma wandering along the highway, burned, bloodied, and unable to speak anything other than Jack's name. But when they searched the zoo, they found only one body beneath the ruined tree, burned beyond recognition, and etched into the charred bark above it were dozens of faces still faintly visible, and locals said the zoo was bulldozed soon after, the tree cut down and buried deep beneath concrete. Yet even now, years later, nothing will grow on that land. Animals refuse to go near it, and sometimes late at night, drivers swear they hear breathing beneath the road, slow and patient, as if something buried very deep is still alive, still remembering, and still waiting for the zoo to open again.